Hello, everyone. Our today's guest is Garett Jones. You can find his socials on the episode description. Garett, thanks for joining.
Oh, very glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm very thrilled. Let's mainly talk about where your three books approach. So I'm gonna link your books to the show notes: Hive Minds, 10% Less Democracy, and Cultural Transplants.
Yeah,
Um,
my Singapore trilogy.
yeah, let's start by Hive Minds. So in Hive Mind, you explain how nation's average IQ hugely impacts its economic performance, much more than individual IQ. How does collective intelligence translate into real world advantages like better infrastructures, innovations, institutions? And yeah, it's there like any surprising case study that shaped your conclusion on this?
Yeah. So I basically where this started off was because I worked with a psychologist, Joel Schneider,
Mm.
on this. He walked me through a lot of the psychometrics, the statistical analysis tools that psychologists use to teach me a bit about how IQ research works.
Right.
And what we did is we found in our first paper that a nation's average IQ was a really strong and really strangely robust predictor of a nation's long run economic performance. And in our second paper, we showed that this created a puzzle because the individual wages don't have that strong a relationship with IQ. People at the individual level who have higher IQs don't earn that much more. So ultimately, our back of the envelope estimate, which has been replicated since then, is that your nation's IQ matters about 6 times more than your own individual IQ. So it's much better to be a dumb fish in a smart pond than a smart fish in a dumb pond. Um, and this is not a surprise because the economy is a team effort. This is something we've known going back to Adam Smith, right? That basically working on a great team in a pin factory, and that was his example, making pins. Working on a great team is really far more important than being you personally being good at any particular skill. So that was the real surprise. I call that the paradox of IQ. And to me, this as an economist, this was a great puzzle because it meant that IQ probably had externalities or spillover effects, side effects that were undocumented by others. So I'd say the big one the one I started off with was that the finding that smarter people are more patient. There is a big literature in psych and econ showing that smarter people are more patient. And economists know that more patient people tend to save more. They give more thought for the morrow. And we also know that a lot of your nation's savings tends to be sticky. It tends to stick in your own country. We're not quite sure why, but it does.
Right.
And so if you're in a nation filled with smart people, that means you're in a nation filled with, on average, patient people, and you get to use their capital whether you saved it or not. That's a simple example. Also, smarter people make better voters. They make better bureaucrats. And those smarter voters, better bureaucrats, tend to build institutions that help the whole country. So even the dumb people get to benefit from being around smart people because the smart people basically end up running a lot of the government, if you're lucky at least. So those are just two examples. I'd say the patience channel and the smarter voters build better institutions channel. Those are both really important and underappreciated by social scientists more generally. They both deserve to be more widely known and shouldn't be controversial.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And what can we do to increase the national IQ?
I'd say for most countries in the world, the easiest way to raise your IQ is to just have a high skilled immigration. So I think that, for instance, one of the reasons why Southeast Asian countries have had a lot of economic miracles is because a lot of them were open to mass immigration from China. And China is a country that where folks seem to have pretty high IQs, at least once they get a decent education, a little bit of decent nutrition. And so I think, for instance, that the Chinese diaspora is a great example of how high-skilled immigration can really increase a nation's prospects. If I had to create a fantasy development program, it would be that the Gates Foundation would subsidize mass migration from China to sub-Saharan Africa voluntarily, peacefully. And I think that's a great way to do it. I mean, it's probably nutrition matters, probably environmental improvements matter, probably better K through 6 education matters, but those are all like probablys with small to maybe medium effects. I think just importing smart people is a smart approach for most countries.
Okay, okay. Like, and if you get adopted, half the gap between the average of two countries goes away, right? So, like, is this one of the ways we can increase global IQ just by moving like kids to countries with good health outcomes that will nourish their intelligence?
I don't believe that closes the gap completely. I don't think that any serious scholar believes that.
Mm,
There might be some bloggers who say it. It can narrow the gap to some extent, but again, this really depends. You know, it's hard to be sure of the degree of convergence. Let's say half, right? Um,
mm.
let's say that could close half the gap if people move from the very lowest IQ countries to higher IQ countries. That by itself is not going to eliminate the gap, according to most estimates. I don't think that's. I mean, people of African descent have lived in the U.S. for a very long time, and yet there is still a massive black-white IQ gap that's incredibly well documented. Unfortunately, it's unfortunate that it exists. It
Yeah.
would be great if it could be eliminated, but regardless of the reasons, whether one wants to argue for genetic or environmental reasons, and environmental would include oppression-based reasons. Regardless of the reasons, we have not yet been able to close those gaps, and so we should not believe that those gaps can be easily eliminated through immigration.
Okay, right. And do you think like the people who are currently Americans, but their ancestry traces back to countries with low SAT scores, is it possible that US GDP per capita would be higher without that contribution?
What are you referring to? What's that contribution? I'm sorry, I want to be clear about the
Yeah,
pronouns
yeah.
here.
For instance, who imagine like a kid who and its fathers were born in a low SAT scores, for instance, like in sub-Saharan Africa or wherever, and they moved to the US.
Uh
Is
huh.
it possible that the US GDP per capita would be higher without that kid moving to the US?
Okay, so one way to think about this is: would America be richer today if America hadn't participated in the great sin of slavery, for instance,
Right.
in the 17 and 1800s? And to which I think the best answer is yes, it would be richer today in GDP per capita terms. Um, that's the best guess we can have at the current time, because the pattern holds up quite robustly elsewhere, and we shouldn't believe the U.S. is any great exception to that rule. Um, that Both within sub-Saharan Africa and when we look at the African diaspora around the world, it is not a predictor of really strong economic performance. And at
Okay.
the current levels of understanding, it looks like, you know, I wish that institutions could be easily adapted to overcome those problems, but my job as a social scientist is to describe the way things are. And again, whether that's due to more sociological stories or genetic stories is something that we have to sort of hope that other researchers will join this project of explaining it. But on average, unless one is being quite selective about immigration, uh, immigration policy that selects for intelligence or for ancestral success are both ways to help make a nation richer. And failing to do that puts a nation at risk of becoming poorer.
Right. Yeah, I want to go back there in a while.
Mm-hmm.
Um, are you a fan of genetic selection for intelligence as a means of increasing national IQ?
Um, Yeah, in general terms, yes. If it's voluntary and peaceful, I've spoken about that a bit this year. I got to give a talk on that in Honduras at Prospera. Um, so it looks as though the new wave of voluntary genomic selection, where people say get 10 eggs fertilized and then have them scanned to find out which ones are least likely to have genetic problems, which ones are more likely to have higher IQ scores or be more conscientious or whatever. If people did select on IQ, um, when doing their in vitro fertilizations, it looks like that would actually have a big benefit to the world as a whole. A lot of people argue that we have to worry about people using embryo selection because it might hurt other people because maybe the world is a zero sum competition, but it's
Mm.
not. The world is a place of pie growing. And if we get more smart people, we're likely to get more geniuses. If we get more smart people, we're likely to get more scientists, more engineers. And those folks build things that get shared and copied worldwide, right? So um, this is something I'm looking forward to formalizing a bit more. But if people want to see my talk on this, I gave a talk on it at Prospera a few months ago at Infinita City in Honduras. You can find it online.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I think that there are good reasons to welcome smarter neighbors, and we should welcome it if our neighbors decide when they do IVF to pick the kid who's a little more likely than average to be a little smarter.
Okay. Yeah, so okay, there's like this blogger and guy that writes on Twitter that is named Nicholas Decker, and I think you
Nick
know
Decker,
him.
he's one of our grad students at George Mason. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I saw
He
that
does very
yesterday.
good blogging, yeah.
You retweeted a tweet of him, but are you his professor at George Mason?
No, I've never actually had him in a class. I haven't taught a PhD core class in a few years, so he hasn't been in any of my classes. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, but he has some no quite controversial opinions, and he recently, like 3 months ago, wrote a blog post saying that he wants to have kids, but he doesn't want them to be the biological kids. So he wants someone better than him, more smarter to be the biological father, because he thinks that it's immoral not to optimize this way. What do you think about this?
Well, let me point out, first of all, that Nick Decker's Twitter feed has excellent reviews of academic research. Other academics are saying this too. His blog gives very good, high-level, and pretty accessible literature reviews. So I really recommend his tweeting and his blogging. So we don't know about Nick's situation, right? We don't know about Nicholas's situation. I actually don't know if he goes by Nick, to be honest. So we don't know about Decker's personal situation, right? So I don't want to claim, I don't want to say that I know whether it's a good idea for him personally or not. But in general, people should ask themselves, should I try to make my kids as good as possible? In some sense, is there anything we're optimizing for when we have children? I mean, most of us want our kids to be, if we have kids, we want them to be happy and healthy and successful in their own lights. It's not that we want them to be billionaires or masters of the universe, but you want something for them that's some personal good. So the question is, should you try to do as much as possible so that your future children will be as happy as possible, as successful as possible by your lights? To which the answer is obviously yes. Just obviously, right? And what gives people the heebie-jeebies, what creeps people out is when they think that for some reason you shouldn't use your own genes for this. And I think if we look around, this is a case where you should look at it from the point of view of no one, right? The view from nowhere, to use the philosopher Thomas Nagel's term. Are there people you know who in principle you think should not reproduce, right? And if we just look around, you'll say, yes, in the privacy of your own heart, you may not feel comfortable saying it on Twitter, but we all know people who we think, yeah, that person's genetic material, that's a dead end. That's not good for humanity. And other people we think would be terrible parents in terms of their behavior, the way they might raise the kid. But some people just have genetic material. You're like, yeah, even if only half of what that person is genetic, let's just not take that risk again. So that's just worrying about the downside, right? It's easiest to focus on the downside. But when we think about the upside, we definitely should be thinking about how can I make my kids as good as possible from their own point of view. And in which case, I think a lot of us should be thinking, is there a way to either improve my own genetics through embryo selection, or should I be using someone else's genetics entirely? Totally reasonable thing that I think people who care about human flourishing should definitely place great weight on what Nicholas has said on that topic.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. So some studies, a lot of studies show that smarter groups cooperate more in dilemmas like the prisoner's dilemma. Could we enhance our social trusts and collaboration through civic IQ boosting initiatives? And what would that look like in practice itself?
That's a good question. Yeah, this is something where I wrote a paper that was called "Are Smarter Groups More Cooperative?" And then later I helped work on an experimental study that found some serious evidence for this. And it's turned out to be pretty robust. It turns out that it's not that smarter individuals are nicer. It's not that smarter individuals are more cooperative. It's that smarter groups find a way to grow the pie, in repeated games especially. And so your question is a good one, which is like, is there something we can do to help people do this, to help people be better at it, just starting with the raw material of the people we have. And here, the book that I draw on a lot, great book, Axelrod's Evolution of Cooperation, is really easy to recommend. He gives some advice on how to create cooperation. One is to help people feel like they're living in a repeated game, that help them see the future, help them see the shadow of the future. So in terms of institutions, for instance, one way you do this is you have the Senate, the U.S. Senate with 6-year terms rather than the House of Representatives with 2-year terms. 6-year terms, longer terms in politics makes people think more about the future. The American Founding Fathers thought about this. It came up in the Federalist Papers. Indirectly, not quite the way I would phrase it, but this is something that people have known for a long time, is that if you put people, longer terms give people more foresight. So I'd say one way to do it is make people feel like they're living in a long run game. Have people meet the same people on a regular basis. This is why I like talking with your neighbors every once in a while, bumping them into them in the hallway, having those small little relationships. That helps build cooperation. So things that breed familiarity, things that breed long time horizons, things that start off on a good foot. These are all ideas that come out of Axelrod's excellent book, The Evolution of Cooperation, and they're ones that I think you really can help build. My guess is, on practice, good local governments try to do this. Like, help. This is why you have icebreakers when you have a bunch of people meet each other, right? Start off on a good foot. And this is why you have repeated meetings in organizations, so people know they don't feel like they're dealing with strangers. So, yes, there are multiple things you can do, and it involves long time horizons, starting off on a good foot, and multiple repeated interactions. So I'd say I'd start there.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And you also, in your work, highlight the Da Vinci effects, where high IQ correlates across intellectual domains. What does that broad correlation reveal about how society should design, for instance, education and public policy to nurture these cross-domain skills?
Oh, yeah. So I call the Da Vinci effect is my term for what psychologists call, say, the G factor,
Yeah.
or the fact that all mental skills are positively correlated. All mental skills are really clearly positively correlated across each other. People who are better at math tend to be better at verbal. And so what your question there is, like, is there a way to actually teach this in any important way? To which my answer is, I don't know. I think that's what we have to say at this point. It's basically, it seems to be a phenomenon of human brains quite generally. The fact that people who are good in one area tend to be good in another. I mean, this is why when if I want to speculate, and it's just speculation, what you want to do is help build broad general skills, because if you give people broad general skills, people, like, knowledge can glom on to that set of general skills later on. So the reason we emphasize reading and arithmetic in school is because those are general human traits that show up quite generally and that help build other traits down the road. That's the best I can say right now. People haven't made a lot of progress on how to build the G factor.
Okay, yeah, that's clarifying. Okay, let's talk about your book, 10% Less Democracy. Okay, yeah, how do you really measure democracy?
Oh, yeah, so this is a case where official surveys that get used a lot lump in real democracy with other good stuff. So when we look around, like, to me, what I think democracy is what the political scientist Robert Dahl of Yale said it was, which is, mass participation in government, where the masses actually have a concrete, if indirect, way of shaping the government. Frequent fair elections, open competition between the parties, the ability of governments to, the ability of political parties to actually get their message out, something like a free press. So I'd say that is what I think of as democracy, is actual voter sovereignty, even if indirect, over the means of power. A lot of people use democracy to mean human rights, to mean a welfare state, to mean an independent judiciary. I don't include that in my definition of democracy unless I'm trying to argue that you need one of those things to get free and fair elections. So when I say democracy, I mean democracy. The rule by the masses, even if indirect. Yeah.
Right. And for the audience that haven't already read this book, Uh, so 10% less democracy. Can you be concrete, practically about what you mean by less democracy?
Yeah, basically, what the alternative to democracy that I really think of is oligarchy, is some kind of elite control, not chaos. And so, and the oligarchs can be judges, an independent judiciary. They can be the Federal Reserve. They can be the Federal Trade Commission. It can be what we think of as the White House, the presidency, the broad set of offices. Even like in a parliamentary system, which is very common in Europe. In
Mm.
parliamentary systems, these governments tend to operate as a form of oligarchy, as a form of elitist rule between elections, right? You have your election,
Yeah.
and then that's the democratic moment. And then for a while, you basically have cabinet government, which is fairly elitist. And those people are expected to go back and talk to the voters a few years later, but they're going to make a lot of little detailed decisions without checking in on the voters. That to me is something that you can dial up or you can dial down. So that's why the title of the book is 10% Less Democracy. I treat this as a continuum, not an either or. So basically, I think more things should be like the Fed and like the federal judiciary, more like the independent judiciary, where judges can't be fired by unhappy voters, where the Federal Reserve has 14-year terms. So those guys are kept away from political pressures. And a moderate amount of that seems to get you good outcomes. Countries that have more independent, more elitist central banks actually have better outcomes than other central banks. So they get lower inflation. They probably have fewer financial crises, and those are both good things too, both good outcomes.
Right. And for the United States, what is like the most effective way, in your view, that would want us to have 10% less democracy?
I mean, if I could just wave a magic wand, one thing I would do is I would get longer terms for the House of Representatives. Those 2-year
Mhm.
terms are very unusual by global standards. Um, so it's very rare anywhere in the world for a legislature to have 2-year terms. And those guys are always basically running for reelection. And they're always scared of the voters. And to me, that's they're too scared of voters. They'd be a little more brave if they had 4 or even maybe even better 6-year terms. That'd be an easy one. More controversial one would be that's a little bit harder to get, would be a lot harder to get, would be to find some way to bring bondholders, the people who own U.S. treasuries, to have some kind
Mhm.
of formal voice in the government. Every government worries about what its investors think. They're always worried about if we if we blow up the deficit too much, will interest rates skyrocket? And this is a reminder that goes back to Alexander Hamilton, that the people who invest in a country, the people who own its bonds, are pretty sound investors. They're pretty reasonable
Yeah.
people. And so we should find a way to get their advice. I don't expect anything big to happen overnight, but it'd be nice to have a formal council of Treasury bondholders. It could just be American bondholders if you're worried about foreign influence. It'd be nice if every 6 months, every year, the Secretary of the Treasury had a big formal 5-day meeting, G7 level meeting, where all the big organizations who invest in U.S. Treasury bonds say, here's what we're worried about. We think the U.S. government is spending too much on this and not enough on that. We think you should change your tax system this way or that way. Not so they could run the government, but just so you get their voice. And I think that'd be a first good step in the way of listening to your investors, just like any good corporation does.
Okay. And it's like reducing the power of the president, a case of less democracy.
That's a great question actually, and it's one that I totally dodge in the book. Um, because the president is a very democratic. He has a very democratic office, right? It's elected. It's in the U.S. It's some weird way, but we use this weird electoral college system, but it's still democratic.
Yeah.
And because I don't have a utopian measure of democracy, and I think that the way to make the presidency more elitist is to basically bite off more of his powers and put it into things like the Fed or the Federal Trade Commission. And the Supreme Court right now is making that harder, not easier, which is, to
Mm.
my mind, unfortunate from the point of view of good governance.
Yeah.
But um, yeah, no, the president is democratic, and this is why one thing I disagree with some of the critics of Donald Trump is I think that when he's making these big decisions that people are mad about, the decisions he's making that people are mad about are largely democratic decisions.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. What do you think are like the conditions where voters are likely to have better judgments than experts?
You know, this is there really aren't that many. That's the thing is like, the People on the right often tell me, hey, that it's the elites have been too naive about mass immigration for a long
Mhm.
time, and the masses are totally right about this. And to which I say, actually, watch what the masses do. The masses hold totally incoherent views on immigration. They want they they basically say they want both less immigration and they want more of all the good things that come from immigration, like lower prices, lower agricultural prices. They have incoherent views, and they like deportations in principle, but they hate every deportation in practice. So I think this is a case where even on the trophy example that conservatives and people on the far right bring to me, it just doesn't hold up. So it's really hard to find an area where the masses are hold a better opinion than the elites. I think a lot of the things that we think of as problems with the elites are the elites worried about what the masses will think 6 months from now.
Okay, right, right, okay. You also argue that more educated voters align better with evidence-based policymakers. In current polarized democracies, is voter education a path to stability, or like do we need structural reforms to offset civic ignorance?
That's a good question. Um, you know, I I'm sympathetic to my colleague Brian Kaplan's view that not much sticks in the education process. That's part of his book, The Case Against Education. That basically stuff doesn't stick. You teach people things for years and years, and not much of it sticks. But there is one case in his own research where education seems to work, and the test example of this is that college education seems to make people more cosmopolitan. Kaplan found a version of this in his own work, which is that one issue where education seemed to predict people's voting opinions pretty well, or the political opinions pretty well, was on international trade. People who go to college tend to be more pro-trade, people who have more education. And I think this shows up more generally in other studies that uh, education doesn't seem to change people's minds on a lot of things, but it does make them sort of more cosmopolitan. It does to make them more culturally lefty. It makes them more tolerant. It makes them more interested in LGBTQ plus rights. It makes them more interested in like trade with foreigners and trying foreign foods. Those
Yes.
things are, you can say they're squishy and mushy, but they're part of helping build a political tolerance that I think helps grease the wheels of global trade, of good society. And it's possible those externalities are so big that we should actually be pretty comfortable with a fair amount of government education. I think that, but then the question is, once they get out of the sort of soft prison of K through 12 education, what can you really hope for after that? And then I don't know. Like I don't know what forms of adult education work other than glib, um, billboards and CIA programs to subtly influence TV programming. To joke just a little bit there, maybe that stuff works. So this is that second form of sort of more propagandistic adult style education. I don't know any good studies of how much any of that works. But K through
Mm.
12 and college squishiness, college cosmopolitanism,
Yeah.
I think that really works, and it has first order effects on human well-being, and I think that's for the good.
Interesting. Okay. What do you think like explains the fact that Europe as a whole are less market friendly than Americans?
Let me try the easy one first, which is that I think Americans are, to a substantial degree, to at least over half of Americans, are people who were the adventurous Europeans. People who were adventurous enough to like get on a boat and risk your life and
Mm.
try out something new. So they're basically the high openness Europeans, right? That's probably more than half of the American population. So I think
Mm.
this would show up in more rigorous studies. There was a study that still hasn't been published yet that looked at this for Sweden, um, that found that people with more unusual last names were those who were more likely to leave Sweden. I still haven't seen it published yet, so maybe maybe it didn't pan out. But the idea that people who that Europe that the lower openness Europeans were the ones who stayed behind is probably quantitatively important, I think, for explaining this. It's also
Mm.
possible to pick something, that I think is more in the European tradition, that Europe's high population density and its proximity to Russia meant that in the 20th century, after the revolution, after the communist revolutions in Eastern Europe, that made Western Europeans much, much more worried about worker revolts. And it's also possible there was just a raw social contagion element that basically sort of leftist ideas, communist ideas were culturally diffusing through a sort of geographic proximity. Could be propaganda channel too. But even from the late 19th century on, right, we saw the rise of social democratic parties in Europe that were sticking hard to worker rights, toward incipient welfare states. And part of that is, I think, due to the high urbanization, high population density in Europe, which meant that urban revolutions could create huge, huge problems. In the United States, by contrast, big political, for the United States as a whole, our most important economic cities tend to not be our most important political cities, right? New York has always been vastly economically more important than Washington, D.C. Yeah. So, and whereas Paris, London, Berlin for most of its history, right? Rome, these are cities where the great economic power is also the great political power. So if you get one, you get both. So it made the risk of worker revolution much more politically dangerous in those countries. So this could be a case where a geographic story, both through nearby communist revolution and the economic geography of European cities, made strong social democracies a much, much more likely than in the U.S.
Okay, yeah, that's nice. Okay, so does democracy has an impact, a direct impact on economic growth?
I'm of the view of the answer to that is no. So Daron Acemoglu, the Nobel laureate, and his co-authors Johnson and Robinson argue that the answer is yes. I think that overwhelmingly the answer is no on this, that democracy is more of a luxury good that is purchased by rich countries as they get more productive. It's something where capitalism, as the rise of a middle class, gives people the sort of skills to get involved in civic life, which makes it natural for there to be democracy. And I think the causal effects just aren't that strong. The best case for democracy being causal is that democracy helps in two ways. For one thing, it helps guarantee that the masses won't have their wealth appropriated from them if they accumulate a bunch of wealth, right? This is a story that's come on in political economy for the last few decades. That the elites give power to the masses, so the masses know, hey, go get your education, and we'll give you the power to make sure that your wealth doesn't all get taxed away. If you get rich, you can keep it. And so to do that, you need to give voting rights to the masses.
Right.
A second argument is that, a little more subtle, is that it comes down to national debt. That basically democracy is a way to credibly commit that the state will not renege, that will not betray its promises to sovereign investors. So people lend money to the government. A king can always say, hey, I'm the king. I don't have to pay this money back. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you lend to when the masses are in charge of the government, the masses have sort of a much more of a care in worrying about the government's credit rating. A king can think, well, I'm old, I don't need to borrow again. Whereas the government is like a corporation. A democracy is more like a corporation, where there's always a generation thinking about the future and the long run potential. So I think those two channels are really potentially the best case to make for democracy being causally important. It's a way of guaranteeing that the state will continue to invest in the median voter. That's one optimistic take. The second is that the state is less likely to break its promises to repay the government national debt.
Okay. Yeah. Yesterday I was reading this very interesting paper about if democracy had a direct impact on economic growth. And yeah, I think their conclusion was the same as yours, that democracy doesn't have a direct impact on economic growth, but it has a significant and positive indirect effects through higher human capital, lower political instability and inflation, higher economic freedom. So, yeah, would you agree with all this?
No, I think a lot of that's just correlational, not causal. So, quite a few years ago, Sala E. Martin co-authored a paper, I believe, with Casey Mulligan, and they looked at policies, and they basically checked to see how policies differ between democracies and non-democracies. And this is a little bit, you can worry about this statistically, but when you're comparing countries that have similar levels of income, their policies are about the same. So, Singapore is not by any measure a full democracy. It's maybe half democracy. And yet it has, low inflation, good education, stable policies, blah, 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 blah. There aren't that many pretty rich democracies, and especially outside the oil countries, which you always want to put off on the side. But I think overall it's hard to find, like, basically, rich countries have strong social safety nets in practice, whether they're democracies or not. The problem is we just don't have that many non-rich democracies. So the evidence is, it's pretty hard to tell whether democracy is just a luxury good, whether they're the equivalent of chandeliers and Lexuses, something that you buy when you get rich.
Okay, right. What do you think about Curtis Yarvin?
Mencius Moldbug. I've read him off and on over the years. I've actually met him. He's very personable and friendly, and if anybody gets a chance to talk to him, he's a friendly, thoughtful person. I've always thought, though, that a lot of his philosophy was basically a mixture of Austrian economics and Lord of the Rings. So it has a sort of a mythic past combined with a real being completely wedded to sort of abstract philosophy. And I think it's like not a great combination. Like, I like a lot of Austrian economics. It's had a lot of influence on my colleagues here. I've read a lot of it myself. I'm a big fan of Hayek. I've read some von Mises. I'm assigning to my students. I assign both of them to my students when opportunity arises. But real history, real evidence teaches us that, his view of monarchy, for instance, is basically wrong, right? So he's cleaned it up since then, but his romanticization of monarchy and his romanticization of the corporation are both wrong for the same reasons, which is that in practice, kings are heavily controlled by their councils. King and council has always been the equilibrium, not the libertarian or anarcho-libertarian ideal of a unified monarch who is the residual claimant on the country. Similarly, big corporations tend to be they're actually run by their boards, right? On a day-to-day basis, the CEO or the president is running the company, but who has the power to hire and fire? It's the board. And the board has and it's a very divided power. It's a very diffuse power. It's a very poorly incentivized power because the board members rarely have big stock ownership in a company. And yet they're the ones who decide whether the CEO stays or goes, lives or dies. And so, in turn, there's the stock market, free market incentives working behind the scenes, pushing the board to behave appropriately. But the fact that real governance, whether in monarchies, traditional monarchies, or in corporations, both tend to truly be oligarchies with some sort of mass force in the background, tells us that his basic model of where good governance comes from is wrong. And if he wants to modify that and say, well, what I really believe is an oligarchy with the masses or the stockholders as a check on the two, well, then he and I are in agreement, right? So, but then his story is much less exciting. So, he's written some good essays. He's helped a lot of young people think about politics. But I hope what a lot of them do once they read him is they start reading a lot of public choice, the classics that my colleagues Buchanan, Tullock, guys like Tullison have written in the past. That there's many ways to de-romanticize the state. It was my late colleague Jim Buchanan who said that public choice is politics without romance. And what Yarvin does is he tries to de-romanticize democracy, but at the same time romanticize governance, right? He hopes that there's a romantic path to getting good governance. And there isn't a romantic path. It's the destruction of romance all the way down. That's what public choice is. And that's why public choice beats the Yarvin-esque worldview.
Okay, nice. Okay, let's talk about immigration and your book Cultural Transplants. Okay, yeah. Are you a supporter of open borders?
No, I'm not a supporter of open borders. I think that there are, I mean, not for the U.S., not for the rich countries. So I, I, um, I think for the richest countries, these countries are special treasures that produce ideas that are used over the entire planet. So that's where the patents come from. That's where the engineering marvels come from. That's where the medical research comes from. And so we need to treat the institutional quality and the innovation capacity in these countries as sacred and to be developed and improved and not to be placed at risk. I unironically argue that there should be open borders for Iceland. So
Yeah.
basically, if the open borders people are right, then we can run an experiment and see if they're right. But we would want to run it if their story is that you can send unlimited numbers of people to rich countries and it won't hurt the institutional quality in those countries in any noticeable way. And if that's true, then let's run this experiment in a country that doesn't create a lot of the world's super innovative ideas. And Iceland would be such a country. It's a nice place. I've been there. And if it had open borders, if you made its population as dense as Singapore, for instance. I did a rough back of the envelope estimate here. If you made Iceland as dense as Singapore is, you'd have like 500 million people thereabout. 500 million with a B, right? So you could fit a lot of people in Iceland if you wanted to, and they've got geothermal power, so they wouldn't have an electricity problem. So, and we can run a test and see if the open borders thing works there, and see if like a lot of people have their standard of living dramatically increase, and see how it goes. But if you do it in the United States, you're placing American innovation at risk, partly through lowering average IQ, partly through lowering the so-called SAT score, the ancestral success rate of the people who live there, I'd say. But also just through stirring up the possibility of ethnic conflict, which is a potential risk for countries. The backlash against immigration, which can be created quite evilly by people of European descent, can actually place institutional quality at risk, and that's really bad.
Right. Okay, but like, don't you think that, in a sense, open borders might be the next step of capitalism? No, especially because like accessing more people, more productivity, more talent within, and like any kind of closed society, whether by closing borders or closing off trade or closing off new ideas, means that they are finished, and the only way to improve your society is to allow to grow, to constantly evolve, allow your millions or billions of citizens to constantly learn, experiment, and experience feedback from others that's especially come from other culture environments that might have a new, fresh perspective.
Well, well, most countries are pretty crummy at being productive. Most countries are terrible at being innovative. And so most countries should not be emulated. So there's only a few countries in the world that actually have high quality institutions. The vast majority of technically important ideas come from what I call the I7, the innovative 7 countries. You can change the list a little bit if you want to, but this list definitely works. The 7 countries that produce most of the world's great ideas are going to be, and most technologically sophisticated innovations, it's going to be 3 in Asia, China, South Korea, Japan, the United States, and then 3 in Europe, France, Germany, the UK. And those are all high population countries that have like a decent number of patents, R&D, scientists, and STEM type scientists, STEM type researchers. And, Switzerland, Italy, India also deserves some honorable mention there, of course. But so basically, most countries aren't worth emulating. There's great ideas, little bits and pieces that you can grab. Like you would want to have any library, you want to have a lot of bad books there because there might be the occasional good idea in there. But capitalism doesn't need capitalism. The Marxists are wrong. Capitalism doesn't run into a crisis if it starts growing. It's not like a shark where if it stops moving forward, it dies. Capitalism can find steady states just fine. So, indeed, people should be worried that bad ideas could show up. I mean, if a lot of communists show up and they spread a lot of communism, I mean, that's not really a live issue right now, but in the early 20th century, it really was, right? So, basically, a big issue for the planet as a whole is amoral familism, basically family values. The idea that I should care more about me and my little team rather than the abstract good, the abstract rule of law. So this is something that's gone back a long time. Sociologists got good at studying this. There's a great book about this called the name just escapes me. Backward Society.
Okay.
But the author came up with the idea of amoral familism. Edward Banfield. Moral Basis of a Backward Society. I just remembered it. The Moral Basis of a Backward Society. Study of Southern Italy. And that's what that's what the rich countries should worry about. Not communism spreading, but just saying, why should I bother following the rules? If I can get away with this little thing, why shouldn't I get away with it? That's what weakens countries and just puts a lot of sand in the gears and brings you down to mediocrity. And it's a very intuitive morality, amoral familism, family values. It's very intuitive and it can slowly destroy progress.
Okay, right. If you had to slip apart like the contribution, the impact of migrants on the culture versus the impact of that migrants have on a country by voting in their political system, how would you slip that apart?
Okay. So this is, I think what you're trying to get at is if you could bring in immigrants who couldn't vote, would that have a bad impact?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So if you could do what the UAE does, what the Gulf states do, where they bring in low-skilled immigrants, but they're never going to be able to vote because the country's not a democracy. I think that's I'm in favor of these sort of guest worker programs because I think they're the practical version of open borders that can actually work. It can work for high-skilled and low-skilled workers. I mean, I'd be very happy to, spend some time in a country like that as a guest worker. I've met quite a few guest workers over my time in my travels. And a lot of them are repeat customers, right? They go back to these countries 2, 3, 4 times. And so the question is, can a country credibly commit to not giving folks the vote? And I definitely believe the Gulf states and Singapore can credibly commit to not giving folks the vote. I do not think that weird countries can make that credible commitment. What Henrich calls the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries, the WEIRD. That's the acronym. Those countries can't credibly commit to that, so it's sort of it's impossible to imagine that really happening on a practical level. So I'd say that open borders for the Gulf states and Singapore is a great idea because they can credibly keep their promise to be unfair and undemocratic to the people who show up because they're not democracies in the first place.
Okay. You think it's fine for people to leave, for example, Omaha and go to New York or Washington, D.C.?
This is a good question. Like, should the U.S. have the equivalent? Would the U.S. have been better off if it had something like the Chinese hukou internal passport system, right? To which I'd say, well, it depends on what they're going to vote for, right? So there are definitely some voters who have made things worse over time. If I could have changed the U.S. Constitution so that Southern rebels, Confederates, could not move to the North and the West, I would have enacted such an amendment. So I would have been in favor of internal passport controls to ban evil Confederates from being able to migrate outside and pass on their bad views to other places. So yeah, I guess I'm against some people being able to migrate and particularly being able to vote in the new place they move to because they make it worse. So.
Okay. Yeah, and like over the long run, should we expect that all tensions and of ethnic diversity to just disappear or fade away?
No, because people are continuously innovative. New ethnic groups are born all the time. And, because there's no sort of, the idea that we all kind of converge to some middle is false, partly because of human innovation. I mean, I'm a descendant of Mormon migrants to Utah, and they've basically created their own ethnicity, right? So Mormon culture is its own thing. That's why you can have so many reality TV shows about Mormons and people are intrigued by them because it's obviously its own ethnicity at this point. I don't think so. I think that human beings are endlessly innovative, partly because we there's a soft self-segregation that we engage in. There are forcible forms of segregation that are more evil. But there's soft segregations that people enforce to help build these cultures. And this shows up in famously the self-segregation models of Schelling, the Nobel laureate. Like even a slight tendency to like being in your own group can lead to strong forms of segregation. That's the Schelling segregation model, which you can. Paul Krugman did wrote a little essay on this a long time ago, worth reading.
Okay.
And so I think that people are going to keep creating new ethnicities. There'll always be foundations for ethnic conflict because human beings are infinitely creative.
Okay. Should we or better, could we design a global cognitive team for shared challenges like climate change or pandemics, just with high IQ people, like a Manhattan project, but it's global?
That's a good question. It's people try to do these things all the time, right? The Nobel laureates actually get together every year or so. Like a bunch of them get together and they have little meetings and nothing ever happens. And they're really smart people. The problem is that what human beings need is focal points, right? This is another Schelling idea that we need focal points, some mixture of focal points and political power to get things done, and that means finding things that can be communicated to the masses. So being able to get your ideas. So there's an element of marketing here, right? You need elites who know how to speak to the masses, and this is why it would have been so much better if Bill Clinton had not had the scandals at the end of his presidency, because he is one of the human beings who's uniquely suited to this, right? So there are only a few people who actually seem to have the skill of basically communicating grand ideas to billions. And, Obama isn't quite there, Clinton definitely was there, and then he sort of lost that power toward the end. But basically, it's that mixture of coming up with great cultural focal points and finding ways to spread them and having some kind of oomph. This is why, it's actually Maxwell Tabarrok, who's my colleague's son, very smart blogger. Maxwell is a great blogger. He's written that basically, all of the externality problems get solved by innovation, right? So we almost lost whales, and we totally would have lost whales by now if it hadn't been for electricity, right? So people need a whale for whale oil lamps. And then we got electricity, and people were like, I don't like the whale oil too much anymore. So it's going to be scientific innovation created by engineers, by nerds, who are going to solve these problems by coming up with new and better solutions, not by banning the externalities, but by and large.
Okay, right. If you could plant a policy seed today, like AI decision aid, civic testing, educational reform, what would you choose to shape the next century of intelligent societies?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of Brian Kaplan's ideas that I've always liked is that we should teach less history and more lessons from history, because people aren't, facts out of context don't mean anything to people. But basically, pedantically telling people, here are a bunch of things that have really been repeated patterns through history, that's really worth hammering through to people. You don't need to know this anecdote or that anecdote as much as you need to know, here's what generally happens. So, and letting people know, for instance, that free trade generally works, and that the winners win more than the losers lose, and people look back and say, we're glad we actually did this thing. That kind of lesson taught 10 or 20 times seems to work out. I think making education more about broad generalizations, the way we teach physics, the way we teach chemistry, these are broad generalizations. We don't treat every experiment as its own little magic thing. We say, here's the generalization. So I think teaching history and social science as broad generalizations about what humanity is like, the way we teach science as broad generalizations, would be a good way to teach. Also, I think more importantly, this is a 10x more important than what I just said, is having AIs be the teachers. And basically, AIs are going to be the best tutors ever. and they can be personalized. And we need to basically be flipping the classroom where AIs tutor people privately, and then they come to the class and have discussions with people, and they get graded on the quality of those discussions, and they get graded on little oral quizzes and essays. I think the sort of flipping the class approach is really where education should go, where AIs become personalized tutors for people, and then the classroom experience becomes the human interaction rather than listening to the professor drone on.
That's interesting. Okay. What's your favorite book?
The Odyssey of Homer. Yeah, it's either that or Leaves of Grass. The Odyssey of Homer is basically the story of one man trying to get home, and I like it because it focuses on a lone person, and I've always sort of, as an intellectual and basically as a nerd growing up, was always a bit of a loner the way Odysseus was. And the fact that it has all these adventures that sort of teach him about humanity as he's trying to find his way to a home that he truly loves and where he's truly appreciated. That's like that's an excellent human journey, and it speaks to me personally.
Can you repeat the title?
The Odyssey of Homer. The Odyssey.
Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna put it on my list.
Mm-hmm.
What's the most important thing you've learned?
I think it really is the fact that the repeated prisoner's dilemma is a guide point for thinking about how humans can peacefully get along with each other, how selfish people can get along with each other. And, the prisoner's dilemma says that if there are two of us, meeting each other, we always have a strong incentive to betray each other if it's a one-shot game. But if we can think of life as a repeated game, then it opens the door to win-win cooperation. And it's a cynical path to a lovey-dovey humanistic lesson, right? That's what I like about the thinking about the repeated prisoner's dilemma, is that it's a story of a velvet glove. It's a story of cynical optimism. And that's at the heart of, I think, of a lot of economic thinking, that there's self-interested behavior can make you realize how grim people can be. But for the last 10,000 years particularly, human beings have found a way to win-win cooperation. And a lot of that is through something like the repeated prisoner's dilemma, finding ways to cooperate peacefully.
Love that. Great. Finally, what's the meaning of life?
I'm a moral nihilist, so I don't think that there's any sort of objective meaning. And I think that means we have to find our own values and decide what we personally value. So the bad part of that, the bad news there is that some people could find bad meaning, and they could decide that their meaning in life is making others suffer, sort of like Iago in Othello, right?
Yeah.
But to me, the great human adventure is something that, as far as we know, has never happened anywhere else in the universe. And this is an adventure that comes from pie-growing behavior, from finding paths to win-win thinking. And I think the best meaning of life is to study this unique miracle that we alone are getting to see, which is humans building something that is innovative and progressive, technologically sophisticated, that involves knowledge and love combined in a beautiful symbiosis.
And are we living the best time?
Yes, I think we're living at potentially the best time if people make use of it. Unfortunately, people only appreciate the best times usually after something really bad has happened. I think this is part of the reason why the 50s felt like a golden age to the people who lived through it, because they lived through and seen the most horrifying experiences that humans had ever created. So we live in potentially the best time if we're smart enough to notice it.
Okay. And you think, like, from now on, with this AI revolution, things will get maybe more, there will, like, be more chaos than a specific time we see until now?
There's the possibility that AI makes it really easy to destroy things and to kill people, but it's also very likely that it makes it easier for people to defend themselves and to help themselves. So far, more knowledge and more intelligence has always been a gift to humanity, as people have gotten smarter and as there have been more minds on the planet, more intelligent minds on the planet, human well-being has increased. That was part of Michael Kremer's famous 1 million BC paper, that basically the more the merrier when it comes to minds on this planet. So I think AI could lead to a world that looks weird, but I think that it's likely to expand the range of human knowledge and expand the range of most likely human health and well-being on a very broad scale.
Okay. Well, Garrett, thanks for coming. It was awesome.
Well, thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure. Glad to talk with you.
Yeah. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye.